There's a quote that I always quote. Moshe Dayan in 1967, 3 days after Israel had occupied the West Bank, said, what we're going to do is, and literally this is what he said, we're going to connect Hebron's electricity network to our central Israeli network, because if we can cut off the electricity in Hebron, that's a hell of a lot more effective than any kind of other kind of riot control we can bring into the system. And of course, it took Oslo for them to actually have complete and total for Israel to have complete and total control over electricity production in the West Bank, which is shocking if you think about it, which is essentially the PA handing over the independence, the autonomy, the possibility of any kind of even having a pocket of independence just on a platter to Israel.
Hello, salam, and welcome to a new episode of the PalFest Podcast. Over the last 2 years, people around the world have watched in horror as the genocide in Gaza has been live streamed onto their screens, in many cases supported and sponsored by their own governments.
In response, I think we've all felt how the global solidarity movement has dramatically expanded in these past 2 years. And as it grows, and as people seek to confront their governments about their complicity, comes the need for a deeper and deeper education.
Yes, Bisan. So many people have been confronted with the horror of the past 2 years and have been almost paralyzed by questions like, how did we get here? Why is this being allowed to happen? How can anybody support a genocide? What can stop it?
Exactly. And those are the questions that are going to run throughout this podcast series. And this week, we have a discussion around a book that was recently featured on the PalFest bookshelf, Resisting Erasure. And we're going to hear today a discussion between 4 educators about it.
We have the very brilliant Laleh Khalili, who spoke to the book's 3 authors, Adam Hanieh, Robert Knox, and Rafeef Ziadah. They delve deep into the history and the wider social forces that drive geopolitical events. As they put it, it's not just 2 sides, Israel and Palestine, it's the material realities of global capitalism. Without an analysis that links Palestine out to the rest of the world, there is a danger of thinking about Palestinians as either superheroes with unlimited resilience. And we've seen this language being used in relation to Palestinians, resilient and extraordinary and brave and courageous and so on and so forth, or sometimes as merely powerless victims.
Exactly, can't agree more. And it's an important conversation, and we're glad to be able to bring it to you for the 3rd episode of the PalFest podcast. We're still brand new, remember, so please do help us connect to our audience by sharing with your friends and colleagues, rating and reviewing, and supporting us on Patreon.
One more thing, please do also subscribe to the PalFest bookshelf so you can get these crucial new books like the one in discussion today delivered straight to your door. Subscribers get a reading package every 2 months, and our response so far has been really, really good. So please come to the PalFest website and subscribe to the bookshelf.
And to introduce you our speakers for today, we have Adam Hanieh, who is a professor of political economy and global development at the University of Exeter. He specializes in the political economy of energy, oil, and capitalism in the Middle East, and the author of Crude Capitalism. Robert Knox is a senior lecturer in law at the University of Liverpool. He focuses on the relationship between capitalism, imperialism, and international law, offering a critical perspective on how these forces interact and influence global and regional conflicts. And Rafeef Ziadah, who's a Palestinian organizer and senior lecturer in politics at King's College in London. Ziadah is deeply involved in Palestinian advocacy, bringing a grassroots perspective to her academic work on imperialism, development, and political movements in the Middle East.
As we mentioned before, they were interviewed by Laleh Khalili, who I'm sure many of you will already be reading. She has a very brilliant new book out called Extractive Capitalism, How Commodities and Cronyism Drive the Global Economy. Let's get to it.
Hello. It's incredibly wonderful and exciting chance for me to talk to three of my favorite people, comrades and friends and colleagues, Adam Hanieh, Rob Knox, and Rafeef Ziadah, about a book that they have recently published about Palestine, which I think emerges out of a series of lectures they gave. But I'm going to ask them to describe the book to us, and then I'm going to ask them a series of questions about it, because I think that there is a kind of an urgency about the material that sits at the heart of this book, which requires us to think through the various elements of it. So, guys, if you could tell me and your audience, a little bit about the emergence of the book, and how the context for its emergence is really relevant to the content of it.
Thank you so much, Laleh. It's always wonderful to be in conversation with you. I can't think of a better person to engage us on this book. Resisting Erasure came out of an exceptionally difficult moment in Palestinian history, the past 2 years of the genocide in Gaza. And it was very early on in the genocide that a call came from Palestinian trade unions asking for global solidarity in the form of trying to stop arms trade and aid that was going to Israel generally to allow it to perpetrate the genocide. At the same time as this call happened, we felt very strongly that there needed to be some serious education around the situation in Palestine. There was a lot of presentism in what was on offer. It was all about that particular moment of what was happening on the ground on that day, as if history had just begun. And we really wanted to explain the emergence of settler colonial capitalism. We wanted to explain Palestinian political economy. We wanted to think through how did we actually get to this moment. So the book emerged. Although it emerged within that moment, the impetus for it was a lot of previous conversations we had through many years around how people conceive of Palestine, understand Palestine, with a persistence to legalism and humanitarianism, where it was always about the legal questions, international law framing Palestine, or just the humanitarian question of disaster. And we really wanted to go out of these modes. And hopefully that's what we managed to capture somewhat in the book. Many thanks, of course, go to the organizers who put together all the workers in Palestine away days and teaching days, because that was the initial plenary that came up with this book. Credit due to Rob Knox for actually saying, Rafeef, you need to sit down and actually write this. You can't just keep going to talks and organizing. I resisted it for as long as humanly possible, but then we finally did do it.
That is really, of course, very relevant also to the content of the book, because Resisting Erasure's subtitle is Capital, Imperialism and Race in Palestine. And in some ways, you guys address each of those big sort of concepts in a chapter, and in a very subtle, very lucid, incredibly jargon-free way. I mean, as an academic, of course, the thing that I immediately thought about the book is, wow, I can set this in every class that I'm teaching. But before we go on to actually talk about what is in the book, I actually want you to say a little bit about, you start the book with a discussion of what it is not. And you just now mentioned something about this is really not just about the humanitarian situation, which is, of course, abject, but it is about something more. So why did you think it was important to say what the book was not? I also really love the fact that you said this is not an argument about magic Palestinians, which, of course, anybody who works in activist circles around, for example, Black organization, anti-Black racist organization, knows about sort of the magic Black person. So can you say a little bit about what the book isn't about before we go on to talk about what it is about?
So I think Rafeef's already kind of addressed the context, and Laleh, you've also alluded to something, which is like, I think what we felt at times in the kind of organizing spaces that we were in was a kind of frustration that like even comrades and good comrades were kind of mirroring a very similar language that you would see from the liberals, from the mainstream press and things like that. Either thinking of this, as we've said, as a kind of like humanitarian crisis, a legal one, and at times, even when well-meaning, people were producing this kind of language which we ultimately did not think was productive. So the language of the magic Palestinians, the kind of, to use a jargonistic term, like fetishist description of people and their special relationship to olive trees, and not any kind of more concrete questions. And look, the reason why we think this is important is kind of intrinsically connected with the question of the content of the book, right? Which is that like all three of us come, sorry if I'm not supposed to say this because we don't want jargon, but from the Marxist tradition. And so all three of us think it's actually really important to understand the kind of deeper and wider social forces which drive particular conflicts, not just as an exercise of intellectual satisfaction, but because you don't get strategy and you don't get tactics right until you understand the situation at that level of complexity. And so part of our problem and the reason with these frameworks is that they were not adequate to grasp, we felt, what was going on. They were very individualizing, decontextualizing. They kind of present Palestinians often as either this kind of like magic force of resilience or these powerless victims. And in both of those instances, what you get is not a real sense of what you should do or how you should do it. It was just a kind of descriptive thing. And we thought, look, in some ways, it's understandable why people have these responses. These are almost like your immediate response to what is going on. It's the kind of like spontaneous forms of political thought of how we might grasp this. But that's not enough if you want to have a serious political response to those issues. So our argument was, we want to look instead in a materialist way about these different elements of what is going on to better understand that. And an important sideline to this that I think is worth mentioning is that all of those approaches, even when they're meant to be positive, can inadvertently kind of reproduce racist and racializing ideas, which don't treat Palestinians as human beings like any other caught in like a series of social relationships, but instead either as helpless victims, racialized in particular ways, or magic heroes. All of these both treat the Palestinian people as somehow intrinsically different from other conflicts that we might be just studying, but also reproduce these kind of racializing colonial stereotypes and tropes that we wanted to avoid. So it's this idea, basically, they were like, you need to know what we're doing wrong to do it right, and we need to understand that in the ways of doing this wrong, people who might be otherwise good comrades are reproducing ideas which just don't work. And that's important to say explicitly, because I do just think many of these perspectives, let's say particularly the humanitarian and legal one, present themselves as seeming like a really easy fix to the situation, when actually they're not, because there are real limits to what they can do and how they describe the situation. So yeah, I think that was the kind of the driving force.
That's brilliant. I'm going to ask you a question that I hadn't thought about asking. How did you think about, all three of you, how did you think about giving these lectures? How did you think about the job of education in a moment that feels particularly urgent, in a moment where the urgency of the devastation of the genocide, the incredible sort of rate of death and destruction that we're seeing Israel inflict on Palestinians, sort of makes one feel like we need to do something. And then, so how do you balance that idea that we need to do something with a more measured, let's sit with the problem and figure it out. Let's think about educating the public. Can you, I hadn't thought about asking you this, but now that you were talking about it, just, I think that needs to be asked, not just for this obvious cause, but for every instance where people are organizing to respond to something horrendous happening right now.
I mean, I could venture a start and then we can just jump in. I mean, So I actually think this is a really important question. And what I would say, especially in the context, frankly, of capitalist social relations, is everything always presents itself to you as a kind of urgent crisis that has to be solved. And that's very true. But if you want to deal with a crisis in an effective way, you have to understand not just its immediacy, but also like the wider factors that are going on. So one thing, and you weren't doing this, but often people will criticize you in this context of being like, well, we're proposing pragmatic things. It's not a pragmatic thing if you haven't thought it through and it's going to fail. So there's a sense in which I think part of the point here is that, like, well, we need to think about things to have effective responses. That's one thing. But the second thing, and I think that this is also another important thing, is that sometimes this kind of immediacy and presentism ignores the fact that people have been thinking about these questions, and especially in the region, for decades, right? And there's a sense in which what people think is a kind of immediate pragmatism is actually a bulldozing over the thought that people have given to a situation over a very wide period of time. And I think sometimes we've just conceived of our work not as just being like you should think this, but also to be like, look, there's a whole tradition of people who have been thinking about these questions. Listen to them and think about how they apply in that situation. And I do think that this is important, and then I'll just shut up, because like the thing with presentism and emergency thinking is it just leads towards liberalism. It leads towards sticking plasters at best over situations without going any deeper. And we can think about this in relation to the climate emergency right now, to anti-racism, to being constantly asked to defer your more systemic or radical critique in the name of acting in the present, which I think firstly leads to ineffective action, because how can you take an effective action if you don't understand the context? But also an infinite deferral of the actual change, the actual movements, the actual things that we need to do to make things better. If your response to a crisis is always to forget your deeper critique in the name of expediency, you will never do anything, because a crisis is precisely the moment in which political forces are summoned up.
Thanks, Rob. That's actually perfect. And it's such a good response, and I can use it. I'm planning on doing so. So let's go to the actual content of the book now. You start the book with a discussion of what. You start the first major lecture of the book is with a discussion of settler colonialism, and a broader sort of this conceptual imagination of settler colonialism as shaping social relations, shaping labor and capital in the settler colony. Why did you think this was important? And what does the settler colonial nature of Israel mean for understanding of how it operates in Palestine and to understanding this particular moment we're in right now?
I'll jump in here, Laleh. Thanks for that question. I mean, it's become quite common in the academic world and also in the activist world over recent years to talk about Israel as a settler colony. And as Rob, I think, rightly pointed out, this is not a term that's just come about newly. It's something that's actually been theorized in the context of Palestine for many decades. But I think all of us felt that there is often a simplistic way in which the term settler colonialism is utilized. In other words, it's often reduced simply to extermination, an attempt to drive out or exterminate indigenous or native populations on the land. The classic cases, of course, being Australia, Canada, United States, as these kind of classic settler colonies. Or in the case of Palestine, a comparison with South African apartheid as the other kind of major settler colonial context that people speak about. So I think, tried to use this term and see its importance in two aspects. The first of these is that when we think about settler colonialism in the context of Israel, it helps us understand why it is Israel is such a critical and crucial ally to American power in the Middle East region. Israel's settler colonial character, the fact that it's based upon the dispossession of the Palestinian population, the expulsion and continued expulsion of Palestinians since 1948, has produced a population in the region that is a much more reliable and dependable ally of the United States than a typical kind of client state, like we can talk about Egypt or Jordan or other states like that, because you have a population that sees its presence in these kind of racialized and heavily militarized ways. It's a hostile force in the region, and it therefore is so much more dependent and a much more dependable ally of the United States than these other kind of client states that fill the region. So in this sense, it is similar to the role that South African apartheid played vis-a-vis Western powers, particularly the United States and Britain, for many decades in the context of the African continent. So that's one side of it, trying to understand what it is about Israel's settler colonial character that makes it such a dependable ally of Western states, and in this way to work against another kind of problematic framing of Palestine that we often hear in activist circles and elsewhere, and that is the lobby argument, that the United States supports Israel because of a lobby, because of the Israel lobby. This is something we argue very heavily against. It's a major theme in the book, is to say, actually, that gets the relationship the wrong way around. It's actually US interests that's driving this relationship. And we can see this very clearly in I think, throughout the whole of the genocide, actually. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that settler colonialism, it lands in different ways in different kind of historical contexts. And in doing so, it transforms the kind of colonized societies in particular ways. And this, we felt, is really important to understand the situation of Palestinians today, in particular, the ways in which labor, Palestinian labor in different parts of Palestine, whether that be in the West Bank or Gaza or inside the 48 territories, were integrated into Israeli capitalism, but also the ways in which certain groups of Palestinians, particularly in the West Bank, benefited and were incorporated into the structures of Israeli settler colonialism. And that is really key to understanding the role of the PA. So that's the second side of the kind of settler colonial framework that we really try to emphasize, because it tells us a lot about the politics of Palestinian politics today, and certainly I think where we're heading in the future.
I think what makes that argument also particularly relevant is because it allows us to see that it isn't just the settler colonial sort of structure that shapes labor and capital in the region, but also the kind of labor apartheid we've got vis-a-vis the migrant workers, for example, in the Gulf, which is also another structure created around the same time in order to generate that system of control as part of sort of serving the empire in the region. So I think it's really useful to think about settler colonialism in the way that you thought, because it allows for us to draw those kinds of analytic analogies, if you will. It's also, for me, one of the other things about the book that is really relevant and quite useful, and in fact, it actually feeds back into the question of the other regional powers of the Gulf, is where you write about linking the liberation of Palestine to other struggles in the region, such as in Sudan and Yemen. I'm actually quoting the book, not as an analogy or in a moralistic sense, but rather in a real and substantive way. So can you say what you mean by this? How does this thinking allow us, how does the liberation of Palestine allow us to think about what is happening in Sudan and Yemen at this particular moment?
I mean, I'll start with this, but I would definitely like the two of you to jump in and correct my misapprehensions. So look, I think, so actually, firstly, to go back to some other discussion we've had, one of the problems with some approaches to thinking about either settler colonialism or race and racialization, right, is they tend to make things look incredibly homogenous, such that it's like, okay, it's like the bad West and the good everyone else. And part of the really, I think, important contribution in this book, but also I think more broadly in the work that Adam and Rafeef have done historically, is that that's not how we need to understand this. Instead, we need to situate the region in a broader framework of global capitalism and understand that the region itself then is structured around, in part, with that framework of global capitalism. So a crucial thing we're trying to do is to say, look, this is not just a kind of like, you know, in kind of a Fanonian way, like colonial Manichaeism. There's a kind of set of complex structural dynamics here rooted in global capitalism and imperialism in the context of the region, right? The reason that's important, and I think the thing that then feeds into all of these things, is because that's where, and again, Rafeef's work is really important here, this brings in the kind of the class dynamics of the region and crucially says, well, look, it's not the case, again, that it's even just Israel versus everyone else. It's that Israel has been, in some sense, and there have been many attempts to do this, integrated into a regional economy in which there are local ruling classes who are integrated into that economy and who have particular interests wedded to the US's project of what it is doing in making that region. That's not every ruling class in the region, but there are many of them. So what that means is that when you are then thinking about dismantling this project, you can't just be like, well, it's the US and Israel and everyone else is against them. That's simply not true on any kind of material level. And frankly, we have seen that play out time and time again in a number of historical ways. So on one level, that honestly just brings us back to the insight that the Palestinian left has had for decades, which is that you need a regional revolution if you want to liberate Palestine, but also vice versa, that these struggles are necessarily intertwined, in part because you have these ruling classes who have antagonistic relationships with their own dominated subordinate working classes, and frequently those working classes are very supportive of Palestine. So the basic setup, I think, for that is crucial then, is like, look, once you take the perspective which Adam and Rafeef have outlined both in this book, but also in their wider work, we understand that it's like, well, actually, the region will have to have a series of liberation struggles for anyone to be able to win, because it's not just two sides, it's the material realities of global capitalism. So that's the one block. The other sense of that, of course, is that then we have to understand, in that context, how the US itself relates to these different constellations of forces and in this kind of way, and therefore the struggles in other regions become crucially important because of the realignment of the US's politics. I think one thing, and then I will let everyone else talk, but that it is important to think about, in relation to what's happened over the past 2 years, is that alongside the direct attacks of the Palestinians, the Israelis have wiped out regional foes to US accumulation, like Hezbollah, like Hamas, obviously, what's happened to Iran's standing. So alongside, and this is why we like linking these struggles together, alongside the direct attack on the Palestinians, there has been a kind of geopolitical and political economic remapping of the region linked to this kind of military policies. And so if we're thinking then about what effectively Palestinian liberation looks like, it's the dismantling of imperialism in the region. And that is not just a kind of allying with, every local ruling class. Because it's not the case. They are also in their own relationships. And so it's only by understanding that perspective, the political economic perspective of regional capitalism and regional powers of accumulation in the context of global capitalism, that we can even think what real liberation might look like.
I think you bring us to exactly the right place for my next question. Yesterday, the Washington Post posted a news item that said Arab states expanded cooperation with Israeli military during Gaza war, files show. And this shows that 6 Arab states got together in Bahrain, Egypt, Jordan, and Qatar. Even Qatar, which sort of, Israelis Zionists like to sort of badmouth, as the home of CENTCOM, of course. And these 6 Arab states were quite happy to ally with Israel because they saw, I guess, Yemen and Iran as kind of dangers. And I suspect that what lies behind this is this larger process of US imperialist capitulation, U.S. imperialist accumulation in the region, but also something that Adam has been particularly writing about for the last few years, which is oil capitalism. So I'm going to invite you guys to talk a little bit about that, please, if you can.
Yeah, so we really, as both Rob and Rafeef have pointed out, really tried in the book to situate Palestine beyond simply the borders of Palestine historically, but really situate it in the bigger story of the region as a whole, and in particular, the emergence of oil as the dominant principal fossil fuel around the middle of the 20th century, around the time of the Second World War, where oil overtook coal as the kind of leading fossil fuel energy source, and this transition took place globally from that middle of the 20th century onwards. And the Middle East was really crucial to that emergence of oil as the dominant fossil fuel, because it allowed oil resources, rich in the Gulf and elsewhere in the Middle East, to be really drawn out at that stage, controlled by American and European oil companies, extraction costs being much lower, close in particular to Western Europe, and really literally fueling the coal to oil transition in Western Europe and elsewhere throughout the 20th century. So what we really say in the book is, if we want to understand why Israel came to play such a crucial role for American interests in the region, we can't separate it from this bigger story of oil's centrality to global capitalism, and the ways in which the Middle East region plays into that globally, particularly after the 1960s onwards, with the nationalization of oil and OPEC and so forth. So it was at this moment, after in particular the 1967 war, where Israel demonstrated its utility to American interests in the region, through beating back Arab nationalism, Nasserism, and kind of the revolutionary movements of the 60s and 70s, that Israel became that central ally of the United States. So what we try to do in the book is to say, look, these two stories are not separate; they need to be told together. The U.S.-Israel relationship is part of also the U.S. Gulf, U.S.-Saudi relationship. And increasingly, and again, this is something we can see very, very clearly today, the United States goal in all of this has been to knit together these two pillars of its power in the region, bring together the Gulf and Israel through this kind of normalization process. So this is I think, really a crucial kind of way of thinking about the U.S.-Israel relationship, because it points to the fact that Palestine is also an ecological issue. It's a question about moving away from fossil fuels. It's a question of the climate. It's not simply a question of the violence afflicted on Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank and elsewhere.
It's a really important point, I think. I believe it was the Saudi Minister of Oil that says that said something to the effect that we are going to pull every single drop of oil out. And I think if we are to challenge this kind of an oil capitalist, settler colonial, labor apartheid sovereignty in the region, the question then becomes also a struggle against that fossil capitalism. Let's so this is a big regional context, and I think the big regional context is incredibly important, as you all have pointed out. But let's move down to Palestine itself. So I want to also talk about a moment of resistance. We know my own work with Palestinians is focused on the 1970s and the emergence of forms of armed struggle in the camps, in the Shatet, in the diaspora. But I think the movement of Palestinians inside the historic borders of Palestine has been incredibly also crucial to putting together a new way, but also causing new roadblocks, if you will, to organization, to Palestinian organization. And what I'm specifically talking about is the First Intifada, which began in December 1987 in Gaza, when an Israeli armored vehicle ran over a bunch of people and triggered an uprising over the course of the next 3 to 4 years that spread throughout the territories occupied, the Palestinian territories occupied in 1967, generated all sorts of grassroots political mobilization, but also not only did it form this kind of a large resistant Palestinian polity that saw itself as struggling in its historic homeland rather than in the diaspora, but also in ways that are not so incredibly positive, it determined the future course of PLO through the negotiations that emerged first in Madrid and then were overtaken in Oslo. So can you guys speak a little bit about the Intifada, how it brought about the Oslo Accords, and what the meaning of Oslo has been, please?
Thanks, Laleh. I just wanted to quickly go back to the question you asked about the writing of the book and education, because while we can sometimes speak abstractly about the analysis and the time of analysis, I just want to also acknowledge that it was extremely difficult to be able to write a book and analyze while there's an ongoing genocide. But I also think that's what Palestinians have had to do and have been forced to do for decades now, always stepping back to analyze, educate as the devastation gets more and more horrendous. And so I think this book is actually in line with a long tradition of Palestinians who've been theorizing and writing from under the rubble during bombardment and while watching the devastation of our people. And we felt the need to put out this analysis because ultimately what we wanted was an end to the genocide. And without an actual analysis that links Palestine to the rest of the region and the world, we end up in the same loop over and over. And I feel this is a good segue for the discussion about Oslo, because we are heading into a similar loop soon around statehood. Of course, the Palestinian Intifada was a highlight in Palestinian resistance and in Palestinian history. Oftentimes, I disagree with the framing of it, that it was this spontaneous action. I think there's a difference between grassroots and spontaneity, and there were actually infrastructures of resistance for the First Intifada to occur. People were organized in certain ways, and the society had a mechanism to be able to resist, and there was a leadership to the Intifada from the grassroots. But this was also a moment that we need to consider regionally, in that what led the PLO at that time into the Oslo Accords and into the acceptance was the leadership in exile, and the war in Iraq as well. This was a moment of real regional transition where the US was strongly coming into the region and talking about visions of a new Middle East that would integrate Israel. The PLO leadership was at that point had been moved from Lebanon to Tunisia. So there was a road that led to Oslo, and it wasn't just a road that had to do with the PLO internally. It had to do with the region, and it also had to do with Palestinian capital. I know, we don't like to speak about Palestinian capital, but Palestinian capital was really a lot of segments of it was pushing for the Oslo Accords because they just wanted a type of solution that would make kind of reinvestment and reintegration palatable, and also make their role with the US closer. One of the strange things about Oslo is that people speak about it quite often, and they'll speak about the physicality of what happened after Oslo, the separation of the West Bank into 3 different segments, which is very important, of course. But what often gets forgotten is the binding political economy of Oslo that essentially created a captive economy for Palestinians. And tried to fragment and dismantle any notion of resistance as well. So we go through a long chapter in the book of discussing Oslo and the specificities of Oslo. And, like sometimes these things, people don't find them like the sexiest topics to talk about. But if we don't understand the system Israel set up during Oslo in terms of taxation, the fact that taxes are rerouted through Israel, and that those taxes and this money that the Palestinian Authority receives are actually the salaries that the public service gets paid. So even as we speak right now, the public sector in Palestine is getting 30% of their salaries or less. And this is not just the security services. We're also speaking about teachers and nurses, and the majority of the society that's actually working in the public services being devastated in this way. And that's because of the customs union and the taxation union that was set up under Oslo. The idea of dual-use goods. We speak often about the devastation of the healthcare sector. You cannot understand that without understanding that Israel deemed so many goods dual use that medical equipment wasn't being allowed in. Internet, electricity were all bound with the Israeli companies. So the Palestinian Authority is sitting there actually paying for the use of electricity to Israeli companies. These deep infrastructures and systems that were set up under Oslo bound the Palestinian economy, but also the Palestinian political decision to Israel. Thinking of this slightly more historically, Zionism has always tried to fragment the Palestinian people, but also there has always been a quest for a leadership that will sign a deal and say, forget it, there's no right of return, we're happy with the way things are. And Israel has tried in very different forms to find that kind of leadership that will, to put it bluntly, sell out Palestinian rights altogether. And if you look at the actual mechanisms of Oslo, it eventually established a kind of leadership that would do that. And I think it's to the credit of the Palestinian people that despite this very intricate system that is quite difficult to describe to outsiders, you still have resistance. You still have people talking about the right of return. They haven't been able to dismantle the idea of Palestine, despite all of the mechanisms. And that, I think, is the real strength of the Palestinian people.
I think what you're saying is really incredibly important. What you were mentioning about how the infrastructures were made to tie into the Israeli economy and infrastructures. There's a quote that I always quote. Moshe Dayan in 1967, 3 days after Israel had occupied the West Bank, said, what we're going to do is, and literally this is what he said, we're going to connect Hebron's electricity network to our central Israeli network, because if we can cut off the electricity in Hebron, that's a hell of a lot more effective than any kind of other kind of riot control we can bring into the system. And of course, it took Oslo for them to actually have complete and total for Israel to have complete and total control over electricity production in the West Bank, which is shocking if you think about it, which is essentially the PA handing over the independence, the autonomy, the possibility of any kind of even having a pocket of independence just on a platter to Israel. It's incredibly enraging. Okay. Let's move on from there to another one of the chapters that you specifically actually shape around the question of racism. And I think it's really important to talk about racism and racialization of Palestinians, not only in Israel, but also more broadly overseas. What I want to do is I want to get you guys to talk about racism and then connect it to both the questions of empire and settler colonialism more broadly, and tell us how to understand racism in this context. What does using the concept of racism give us? What kind of analytic purchase does it provide?
So I think I'll start off by just saying that even outside of, so more broadly, outside of the question of Palestine and the question of the book, a thing that I think all three of us share is a kind of frustration with how discussions about racism and race on the left and more broadly go. Because we are three people who are really interested and think it's really important to understand the central place of racism, race, and racialization in the operationalization of global capitalism, right? But we frequently find ourselves between either like grumpy old Marxists who are like, well, this is just an effect, and shouldn't we have universalism? And people who are more committed to an anti-racist politics, but who are like, we don't want to talk about capitalism or want to treat race in ways that we find to be too freestanding, self-standing. And I think all three of us find ourselves constantly pinging between two camps, and either and being in one and being like, oh my God, they're so bad. The other one is better. And then being in the other one and being like, oh my God, there's constant kind of oscillation. And the point is, in the Palestine case is an example of the real practical consequences of some of those problems, because we find that people's approach to thinking about racism and race in relation to Palestine like reproduces these issues, right? Either a kind of like race as unimportant and the material stuff as all encompassing, or a kind of well, why are you talking about the material stuff, because race is like the prime mover, primordial subject of all. And in various contexts, depending on how that gets theorized, that can be problematic for solidarity, for understanding how capitalism works, and it's a real significant thing. So I think that's an important context, both in a concrete, practical, political sense for our understanding, and in a broader kind of theoretical sense. And I think this is reflected more broadly in the fact that, so one thing that is good is that people are having more discussions and debates about the relationship specifically between capitalism and racism, and how that plays out in ways that we often find unsatisfactory. And so I think, in some senses, that's one of the broader framing things of this chapter. And it's also the thing that like I think we've all done work on in different ways. And so like Adam and Rafeef have this really brilliant article in Historical Materialism about misperceptions at the border, thinking about this. So obviously now, and the book was not the place to get like too much into the kind of like overly theoretical discussions, brackets, which I still think are important. But essentially, I think what we would say is something like there is a structural interrelationship between capitalist social relations and forms and practices of racialization, and from the phenomenon of race as a kind of emerging as this kind of like global practice of ruling and governing. Now, I know sometimes some people are like, oh, but, capitalism doesn't abstractly need race. I'm skeptical of that, but I'm also like, we don't live in abstract capitalism. So, got to do what we got to. So look, what we understand on that basis is that when you think about the way in which capitalist social processes have made themselves manifest in the world, and particularly a world marked by the social forms of nations and uneven like political and economic development, race has been the language and the way in which capitalism has made itself known in the world. To observe the history of capitalism is to observe a history of racialization, of dispossession, of differentiation, of exploitation. But that also crucially means, and this is the point where we're kind of hopping between these different positions, I think to find the correct one, not just triangulating, is to understand that there is not a fixed internal meaning of what racism is, but rather that racism is a protean thing which changes in different contexts and in different ways. And so racism has been a crucial way in which capitalism has walked throughout the world and transformed it, and you kind of need to understand those in both ways. Racism is the way in which capitalism often makes itself known and active in the world, which means you can't understand racism without capitalism, but equally you can't understand capitalism without racism. That's the kind of more theoretical than I thought it would be, but there we go. And so the thing in that context, right, is that insofar as what we're trying to do is situate Palestine in the kind of material and historical context of capitalism, of course, that means understanding Palestine in the context of race and racialization. So in part, a simple historical perusal of this, of how Palestine becomes what it is today, demonstrates this to us. Even before the foundation of the state of Israel, race often expressed in juridical categories was what allowed imperial interests to shape and transform the region in various ways. And that wasn't just as a kind of ex post facto justification, but also as a mechanism for this transformation, for discipline, etc., etc., etc. To state the obvious, like we get the region, we get the First World War, and then we have a racialized language in, technical history, like the League of Mandate system, which essentially basically says who's more or less civilized. And this is what gives Britain specifically the power to exercise its governance function over Palestine to begin with. Now, Britain, when it is thinking about how to expand its imperial power in the region, as Adam says, because of partly its energy potential, understands, and this comes back to the settler colonialism point that we can develop, that there is a sense in which if it can have a racialized Jewish population that owes it something in the region, the British understand that, as anti-Semitic as they are at the time, as the mechanism for the kind of deployment of imperial power in the region, right? So you get the whole context of the way in which all of this comes about is shaped by a kind of imperial racism, which itself is inextricable from capitalist accumulation. Broad background. If we now skip to kind of some of the more present day stuff, we can very clearly see the central role in which that racism and racialization plays in this context. And both the articulation of an anti-Palestinian racism, but the connection of that with a wider architecture of racism, both globally and regionally, right? And what we try and do in that chapter is kind of say, like, look, this is operating at different levels. There's a very obvious level, which is the level that the Israeli state racializes Palestinians essentially as this continual threat, this kind of savage threat of people who are like always on the verge of terrorism, and they're a continual threat in this way. And this opens up a whole security apparatus, right? But what's also crucial is the way in which that language of racialization becomes globalized and regionalized. And in part, there's a very literal reading of this, which is that like the kind of policies, literal technology, and legal arguments developed by the Israeli state in this racialized way become the bedrock of the war on terror, which was essentially, for those of you who don't remember, like one of the undergirding racialized argument for the projection of US imperial power across the region for the past, 20 years, so old. But so when we understand it this way, we can kind of see that you have to understand Palestine in that context. That also then undergirds various regional responses where the racialized language of terror actually is a part of a way of the US connecting itself with the kind of local ruling classes who themselves begin to deploy these technologies. So there's a kind of concrete thing like that. And at the same time, in a kind of move which I think is being increasingly contested today, obviously that has been deployed as a language of legitimizing Israeli actions to the wider public. The kind of threat of a kind of racialized terrorism as this kind of ultimate justification, which has then also filtered into the kind of internal policing of imperialist states who increasingly deploy this kind of language and rhetoric against people acting in solidarity with the Palestinians and beyond. I mean, this is most obvious today with actions of proscription and counter-terror. But I don't know if anyone remembers there was this whole thing about how MPs were being accosted on the street and there's a secret exit from Parliament, as if people who were supporting Palestine were by definition some kind of terrifying subject. And that was part and parcel of this act of racialization in this kind of way. So what you get then, I think, is, and I'm rambling, so put up, but we have this project of accumulation which has been expressed and articulated in these racialized terms. And in one of the particular ways in which that has now happened is through this articulation of terror as a kind of malleable mechanism that has globalized and has also undergirded much is going on. I mean, we could also point out on different axes, and I think this is why it's important to think about how these speak, the racialization of imported labor in the Israeli state, where kind of the migrant labor that the Israeli state is imported is itself in this pattern of how racialization is working, right? And then to tie this all together, just to make this very concrete, this is also the central point that Adam has already made, and I think is a central element of this book. The particular form of racialization and the kind of necessary racialization involved in settler colonialism is what makes the Israeli state a very particular kind of ally and a very important ally for the Americans in the region. Because of this kind of like racial like hierarchy and integration into the region, there's not a sense in which the Israeli state is going to be totally unreliable. There's always that level of reliability in that way. So the crucial point then is just that all of these things come together in helping us to understand the precarious position of the Palestinians, but also of the crucial matter of linking together different struggles. Like if as Adam said, like, okay, well, the Palestinian struggle is also an ecological struggle, which it is, and it's an anti-racist struggle, and it's an anti-imperial struggle, and it's an anti-capitalist struggle, we can see how these all come out of the same set of material processes, and we need a political force that can challenge that.
Thank you. Rafeef, Adam, do you want to say anything about that, specifically about the sort of the anti-Palestinian racisms, but also the racialization of Palestine and Israel to the court in the region or beyond?
Sorry, we're nodding at each other, not sure who should go first. I mean, I think the last 2 years, what I would say, and I agree with Rob's analysis, but I think the racism we have faced, we felt it at such a visceral level that we're able to watch so much death and for it to be taken for granted, and for politicians to just accept it and speak against demonstrators instead of do anything to be able to stop the genocide or talk about the arms trade. To be very, very honest, I thought I understood racism. I'd been studying it my entire life, but the last 2 years have given entire new meanings to how you experience racism and how you feel it. And to me, it's devastating the way it's become so acceptable in the last 2 years that people watched a televised genocide. I want to acknowledge, though, that there is a bit of a tension in Palestine studies around the term anti-Palestinian racism and how we discuss racism, because there is sometimes this tension, which I disagree with, between, no, this is an anti-colonial struggle, it's not an anti-racist struggle. And I think that's because people are thinking of liberal anti-racist struggles, and the way anti-racism has been kind of adopted into this very liberal framing to be about, I'm just feeling uncomfortable, and people feeling like that takes away from Palestine being an anti-colonial struggle. So what we tried to do in this particular chapter is actually speak about racism in a very serious, analytical way that links it to the anti-imperialist, anti-colonial tradition that has written and analyzed and discussed racism historically. Thinking of authors like Walter Rodney or Fanon, that always, Angela Davis's work, of course, that always put racism front and center when discussing anti-colonial struggles. We simply cannot understand the situation in Palestine without understanding how racism was structured historically through the Zionist project, what it meant, subjugating Palestinians as a people that had no civilization, had no land, backwards people to be saved. But not just historically at this moment, how it's playing out with all the war on terror rhetoric, and how Palestinians become this like founding ground for all these racist ideologies to be perpetrated around the world. I will add finally that I think there's a gendered element to this racialization. And people have been writing more and more about this. So I'm very familiar with how Palestinian women are racialized. We're racialized as, just breeding babies, and that's our function in the world, and how that's a threat to the Zionist project. But on the other hand, Palestinian men are also racialized in a certain way that, their lives don't matter. They're all one generic man that is disposable, dispensable, and ungrievable as well. And again, the last 2 years have made that so starkly obvious. And I don't want to anymore have to explain, no, Palestinian men are human. No, they have feelings. No, they play with cats. I think that in itself is dehumanizing, the fact that we constantly have to humanize ourselves, and it shows the level of racism. But what we were trying to do in the book, to go back to the chapter, is actually deal with anti-racism in a serious, both historical and analytical way, so we could use it in our organizing in a way that's helpful, but also links us to other struggles, not as just saying, oh, everything is racism, but looking at the differences of how racism functions in particular areas and how settler colonialism also shapes racialization.
I think you're spot on. I'm sorry, Adam, did you want to go in?
Just very quickly, just to add just on to what Rob and Rafeef have said, that I think it's very striking, not only in the way that the kind of casual racism that people have adopted in viewing this genocide over the last few years, but also the way in which the far right and racist movements have really made anti-Palestinian racism the center of their kind of ideological tropes. It's striking to me that you look in the UK, you look in the US, and you look elsewhere, the way in which the far right carries Israeli flags and has really become the cheerleaders of both Zionism but also anti-Palestinian racism. So we can see it on the flip side as well. I think this is a very important part of understanding the character of the far right today at a global level.
But also the character of Zionism at a global level. I mean, it is quite interesting for me, for example, to see that in Ireland, well, pretty much since the State of Israel was established, unionists were always unionists, who are basically servants of empire, were always carrying Israeli flags, and the Irish anti-colonial struggle always associated itself with Palestine. So I think there's a longer history also of recognizing that Zionism very easily feeds into fascist right-wing ideologies, simply because it is a part and parcel of that form of capitalist ideology. Rob, did you want to add something?
Well, it was just very briefly and it kind of just come in with everything that you've all said. So I think one thing I wanted to say about the kind of the grievability of life, Rafeef, is that this is also not just a kind of presentational issue, right? Like, as in, like, one of the things that I think is important to understand about the way in which, like, the war on terror stuff works is, like, this becomes built into, like, targeting decisions in the military context. So signature strikes in Afghanistan are like, if you are a male and you are over the age of 18, then you can be a target for drone strikes because you fit a profile. And I think that's important because it links to, I think, the things that both Laleh and Adam have said, which is, like, I do think one of the reasons why the far right has been able to grasp onto this language is because the war on terror mainstreamed Islamophobia as basically the total normal, okay form of racism in the Western world, which has made it very difficult for any, like, supposedly liberal politician to respond to the far right, except to be like, maybe do it a little bit less. Like, their rhetoric is very similar. And I think in the context then of, like, if we think about Ireland, the kind of counterinsurgency, terrorism, racialization link is literally right there in Ireland too, in terms of populations who get racialized as a threat or as suspicious through this language of terrorism too.
Absolutely. I think it's not just Islamophobia either. I mean, there's a particular way that Arabophobia also has become, it's like suddenly all Muslims are Arabs, all Arabs are thought to be Muslim, and all Arabs are a danger, and they're all terrorists. And so there's these kinds of specious equations made by all sorts of characters, which are deeply problematic. That brings us to the question of normalization. And you guys, in the context both of the regional connections of Zionism, but also these processes of pacification that started with Oslo, well, didn't start with Oslo, it started long before that, but which intensified with Oslo. We have the process of normalization now being put front and center, going back to that Washington Post article about the 6 Arab countries. Can you talk a little bit about what normalization means and how to counter it?
Yes, I've been writing quite a lot about normalization, and unfortunately for all my sins have spent the last 2 weeks looking at the leaked Trump plan, which was essentially a blueprint for normalization. So Normalization is quite a common word that we use in Arabic, the tatbi', which has always been the idea of making Israel and the Zionist project normal in the region, having normal relations, integrated economically, diplomatically. It became much more used in the lexicon of the anti-colonial movements in the region, especially after Egypt signed the peace deal in 1979 to normalize its relations. And of course, Oslo in itself, although people don't often write about it in this way, was a normalization agreement. The PLO was to accept Israel, have economic ties with it. The two-state solution in itself was embedded in this language of normalizing relations. And what we see coming back now with a vengeance is this language of normalization. I do want to put it in the context of this US plan for a new Middle East that has come back and reemerged in different phases and ways since the first Gulf War into the second Gulf War. This idea that what you need is economic peace, forgetting about political demands, Palestinian historical demands, but that the economy being integrated is going to be the only resolution. And this was the concrete basis for the Abraham Accords that normalized relations between Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain, with Morocco joining later and Sudan in the process but still stalled. So this idea that economies being interconnected is going to lead into peace is a way to sideline completely the Palestinian struggle for freedom, for liberation, for right of return. I would urge people, if you have the time and, sadism, to think about downloading that Trump document, because it really draws together this idea of the Abraham Accords and the future of Gaza very closely. Everything is spoken about in the language of Abrahamic corridors and framing Gaza as signing onto the Abraham Accords so there could be economic peace and prosperity. This, of course, is always at the cost of Palestinians just accepting these terms of surrender, accepting that their position is going to be as cheap labor if they stay on their land, with these big mega projects that tie in Gulf capital with Israeli technology and Israeli investments. And we see this really materializing in very clear, obvious ways through infrastructures. We always think about normalization, and in the activist sector, it's become much more about people connecting around art and working together, Israelis and Palestinians coming together. But really the insidious part about normalization is how it's embedding Israel in the economies of the rest of the region. So you see the gas deals with Jordan and Egypt. This is Israeli gas flowing through Egypt and Jordan. So if you are somebody who's Jordanian, you're paying tax bills to Israeli for Israeli gas, essentially. And this continued throughout the genocide. And this is what's extremely important, is despite all of the rhetoric, all of these countries surrounding Palestine and in the region continued with normalization. It slowed it down. They went a little bit less bombastic in terms of showing up and saying their MOUs very publicly, but the actual flow of goods and the actual signing of these documents continued. And I think part of the reason we are at this stage again is because of these normalization deals. And in the next phase, we need to watch out for what those look like. We need to watch out for this discussion about statehood in the context of normalization. And this is the note that we end the book on. And although we wrote the book a while back, we could foresee this language of statehood coming back, embedded in this idea of economic peace at the expense of no rights and no right of return. And the reason I keep saying right of return is that is one very important litmus test to see what is happening in Palestine. If people are saying there's never going to be a right of return for Palestinian refugees, that is essentially saying the majority of Palestinians can just be ignored, and Palestinians could live on slivers of their land as an occupied population. I think Adam can speak to this a lot more, but that's the note. We end the book on a note of caution to what this next moment is going to hold for Palestinians.
I mean, one can see that if the Starmer government actually or Macron recognizes Palestine as a state, then it's a completely meaningless venture. Did you want to say something, Adam, about normalization, or should we move on to the next question? Okay, so this really is. This has been an amazing, although dispiriting, discussion, and so. But I want to end it on a more positive note. So the book emerged out of a series of talks that Workers for Palestine organized as a kind of an educational, as a way of ensuring that the people who are organizing actually know the context more in a more politically grounded sort of way. And of course, the subjects that you've talked about, although they may seem theoretical, although they do draw on history, although they look at political economy, are actually very directly relevant to the question of political organizing and action. So let me ask you, as the final question, what is to be done? The old Leninist question. How are we to think about, given the way that settler colonialism thrives on its regional connections with other forms of labor, capital accumulation and labor exploitation, given the depths of racism and racialization that interweaves the Israeli Zionist project into the fabric of European and American way of being, system of being, I should say. What is to be done?
I might just begin with that. I think that the first point is to realize that the ceasefire and the kinds of negotiations and triumphalism that we're seeing on behalf of the Trump administration in the last few days is not the end of Israel's violence. It's not the end of the onslaught on Gaza or the occupation of the West Bank and the continued now 80 years usurpation of Palestinian lives and livelihoods. That this a moment of ceasefire actually could actually portend an intensification of these kinds of things, because it draws the attention of the world away from the realities on the ground. And none of those realities are altered by the fact of this kind of triumphalism that we're seeing from the American administration. So in terms of, I'd kind of end with three points around this. I think the first thing is that over the last 2 years, despite the horrors of the genocide and the horrors we've seen in Gaza, that there has been an enormous outpouring of solidarity that is really unprecedented around the case of Palestine at a global level. The fact that you see Palestinian flags everywhere, you see mobilizations of hundreds of thousands of millions of people globally in support of Palestine, basically on a weekly basis over the last 2 years. The incredible actions at ports and at arms factories, the different kinds of boycott, divestment and sanctions campaigns that have really taken over. So this kind of if you like, radicalization, I think is really something that is an enormous. We begin the pamphlet, actually, the book, with this point that it's an unprecedented kind of radicalization, and is linked to very clearly other social struggles as well, for all the reasons that we've talked about over the last hour or so. So I think we need to keep building these kinds of movements, building these kinds of solidarity, and making sure they don't disappear, that this kind of shift in consciousness, this deepening of understanding around Palestine isn't lost because the world's attention might move away. in this coming period. And I think Rafeef's point about really grounding our understanding around questions such as the right of return of Palestinian refugees is central. Also understanding the situation of Palestinian citizens in Israel proper, the fact that this is a body of Palestinians that are often forgotten but are no less central to the question of Palestinian liberation, and of course the occupied territories in Gaza and the West Bank. So that's the first thing, I think, kind of building, continuing to deepen and making sure those movements don't disappear. The second thing I would say is that given the horrific scorched earth destruction of Gaza itself, the infrastructure, the lives lost, the hospitals, the academic institutions, the sanitation and infrastructure that we've seen, that we need to be really in opposition very clearly to the kinds of fantastical visions that Rafeef has spoken about in terms of the Trump and Blair and Netanyahu plans for Gaza. We really, I think, need to take the lead of people on the ground and institutions on the ground that have continued to operate and survive despite the genocide itself. So that, I think, is something that really is very important. Those of us who work in academic institutions, for example, the questions of Gaza's higher education institutions need to be really, I think, foregrounded in the kinds of work we do on universities. And a part of this kind of resisting these fantastical and genocidal, frankly, visions that we're seeing being put forward as part of these ceasefire negotiations is really highlighting, I think, this question of normalization that Rafeef spoke to, because there is no doubt the Gulf states will be integrated into these kinds of plans that we will see in Gaza. And then the third point is the point that I think we've raised a number of times here, and Laleh, you spoke to also, is that we need to be very careful about this language of statehood and sovereignty, and realize the problems with this kind of framing of the question of Palestine as simply being a question of sovereignty or statehood. This is precisely what happened during the Oslo period, and is why we so consciously spent so much time in the book speaking about Oslo and trying to unpack what Oslo actually represented. What Oslo did, in addition to the questions of normalization that Rafeef spoke to, it reduced Palestine to bartering over these slithers of territory in the West Bank. It helped constitute the Palestinian Authority in the ways that we've discussed, and it was really just framed as a way of depoliticizing Palestine and reducing Palestine to these questions of territorial sovereignty and forgetting the questions of right of return and Palestinian citizens in Israel. So I think the entire history of the last 80 years has really shown that settler colonialism works through these twinning of these periods of intense and brutal violence alongside negotiations and periods of apparent self-calm. But it doesn't change the underlying character of what Israel is doing in the region. These are two sides of the same coin. And that's, I think, the way we need to understand these questions of statehood and sovereignty moving forward.
Thank you. Rafeef or Rob?
Do you want to say something, Rafeef? Or wait, I don't know. Who will say something first?
Go for it.
I'll be quick. I'll just say little things. So one thing is, like, on the dispiriting point, and this is just me being overly theoretical, but like I actually think in some ways it's not dispiriting, because one of the things I find with the kind of, like, let's say, more liberal approaches is they kind of envisage this as eternal. They're like, this is the eternal religious hatred of these groups, and they don't have a sense of there being a solution. I think we genuinely are like, well, it's a challenge to get where you want to get to, but we have a sense of how you can do it. And I do think, like, sometimes, this is like the old Marxist credos in general. It's like, just because you can present something as challenging, if you can present how you can end it, if you can present that it's not eternal, there is a kind of certain value in that, I think. So then, just very briefly, a couple of other thoughts, and typically I'm always like a little bit more pessimistic than Adam. So we're we're a trio of different positions, but I think a few just like brief things to say. The utility of what we've tried to do in the pamphlet is to try and help people think what things that they can do beyond just kind of like consciousness raising, right? The sense, if we think about this as like a material situation, we can think about pressure points, we can think about weak points, and I think we can think about spaces that we can do things in. I say this because one of the things that I think is really actually also runs through a lot of these discussions, both in terms of governments in the West, but also in the region, is that the Israeli state is increasingly unpopular among the global majority of people, but governments and states are doing, I won't swear, but like not very much about it. Like, it's interesting, I think, to see how much fissures have opened up between populations and the people that govern them. From the actions of the British state, you would not imagine that basically there's a huge number of people in Britain like in solidarity with Palestine. So I partly think we have to think of that as a political opportunity too, which are what of the ways in which we can leverage that fissure? How can we push states and governments to act in different ways? And, you know, like even on a banal level, it's worth saying, like in that general election, the threat that pro-Palestine candidates like posed in the general election towards pushing the government in particular ways is important. And I think trying to think about how we can foreground Palestine and Palestinian solidarity in those kind of political practices is important. The second thing in this vein is that, you know, one of the things that we say in the final chapter is that one of the ways in which racism operates is it makes it out as if like solidarity with Palestine is a strange, kooky thing that has nothing to do with our political work. And you can see like certain trade unions at certain points endorsing that. And I do think in the places where we are all active, making concrete political demands about what our workplaces, our trade unions can do in Palestine solidarity is important, because actually the whole point about Palestine, like the enmeshment of the political economy of the region in Britain, is that there are things you can do and material things that you can do. So to me, another concrete thing that people should be doing is having discussions about how at the levels in which they work, in which they organize, they can bring Palestine to the fore and raise those kind of material questions in that kind of way. And I do think the third point is like, whatever, I'm just a Marxist, so I don't have that many immediate solutions to anything. But I do think Adam's point is really important, which is that we have to think about how we take momentum. And this goes back to the very first thing you said, Laleh, about immediacy, and turn that into political commitments that are there for a longer time, that understand that like any of these struggles are going to be a bit longer, and think, well, what are the ways in which we can take the politicization occasioned by the most recent disgusting things that have been happening and turn them into longer political commitments to build movements which will be able to be effective in the long run. Given everything we've said, we wouldn't expect that tomorrow we would just be able to solve the problem. The question is like, how are we building a political project, and how are we making that political project concrete in people's lives to be adequate to the tasks that we need to achieve? And I'm actually kind of hopeful that we can do that. And that is partly why it's also important, as I would say, I'm an academic, to get our understanding and our analysis right, because that's also a crucial way to build these kind of movements, providing you understand that you can't just write articles about it.
Thanks, Rob. Rafeef, I'm going to give you the last word. What is to be done?
I'm not sure what is to be done right now. I was watching television yesterday, and I saw people walking back to their homes by the sea. And for me, Gaza and this last genocide was always about how Gaza is also our last out on the Mediterranean Sea. And just watching people go back felt hopeful, felt like we're still here. And if you think of colonial projects as trying to destroy and fragment, in the last 2 years, I have seen the best of organizing and sadly the worst of organizing. People coming together, trying to build together, going out on protests, trying to shut down arms factories. But also, some of the afflictions of the left and activist circles of turning on each other, not knowing what to do and taking it out on each other, trying to be more radical than everyone else in the room, just for the sake of it. So I think there's a lot of self-reflection to be done in the next period about how do we organize better, and how do we think of this moment and make sure that all the people we have lost, and we have lost so many, how do we make sure their memories stay with us in our organizing and in what comes next. And that, I think it's okay to say it will take us some time to come to terms with what's happened and who we've come out of this as. We've all changed to different people. The world has changed, and it shouldn't go back to what it was. To me, that's what I'm most scared of. I'm scared of people saying, oh, it's all over now, ceasefire has happened. Because actually it's always in moments of ceasefire where the real damage takes place. And Adam already said how terrible the conditions are on the ground. There's a lot of work to be done. And it's okay not to have all the answers right now, but to just make sure that we keep going, and for people not to just go home and say it's done with. A lot of people have put in many hours of organizing for so long, and I understand people are tired. But Gaza is still Gaza, and Palestine is still occupied. And until there's liberation, we shouldn't be stopping. And I say that with also being kind to ourselves in this moment and recognizing just what this genocide has meant.
The struggle is long. Thank you very much. On that at once hopeful and quite melancholy note, I really want to thank you, Rob, Rafeef, and Adam, for your amazing book, Resisting Erasure, Capitalism, Imperialism and Race in Palestine. As you can tell, it's a very rich book, but written incredibly lucidly. If you're an academic or teach in a secondary school, you can set this book incredibly easily. Students can understand it. You can buy it and pass it around to the people in your workplace, in your unions, in your community organizations. It's an amazing document, and I am very grateful to be your friend and comrade in the struggle. Thank you.
Thank you, Laleh.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow, what a brilliant conversation. To me, for someone who wants to introduce Palestine to an international, it felt like a crash course on Palestine solidarity and how to understand Palestine and how to talk about Palestine. So well done to our amazing hosts and speakers. Please, I'd like to remind you to like, share, and rate, and subscribe to the podcast, and subscribe to Bookshelf or gift it to someone, and keep an eye on the Patreon for some upcoming rewards.
Truly, Bisan, I couldn't agree more. It was an instructive conversation. I learned so much from it. And as I'm sure many people like me will find it enlightening, engaging, and illuminating.